CEO orders steak in German. The black waitress replies, fluently with a note, and he freezes. The rain hammered against the windows of Marcello's, Chicago's most exclusive steakhouse, where reservations were booked months in advance and a single dinner could cost more than most people earned in a week. The warm, amber lighting inside created a stark contrast to the gray storm outside, casting golden shadows across the mahogany tables and leather chairs. At the center table, positioned perfectly to be seen by everyone who entered, sat Marcus Steinberg, a man whose presence commanded attention without him saying a word. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back with precision. His charcoal suit cost more than a car, and his Patek Philippe watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Marcus was the kind of man who measured his worth in millions and his importance by how many people waited for his approval. As CEO of Steinberg Industries, he controlled the careers of thousands, and he never let anyone forget it. Tonight, he sat with 3 junior executives from his company, men who laughed too loudly at his jokes and agreed too quickly with his opinions, their nervous energy filling the space between them like static electricity. Across the restaurant, weaving between tables with practiced grace, moved Amara Johnson, 23 years old and working her way through her final year of university. Her uniform was crisp and pressed, her natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and her smile never wavered despite the aching in her feet from her double shift. She had been serving tables at Marcello's for 2 years now, using every penny to pay for her education while supporting her younger brother through high school. Most customers saw her as part of the furniture, someone who appeared with their food and disappeared with their empty plates, invisible except when needed. But Amar had learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage a person could have. She spoke 5 languages fluently, had a near-perfect GPA in international business, and could read people better than most psychologists. Tonight, she watched the table of executives with careful attention, noting how the 3 younger men seemed to shrink in their seats every time Marcus spoke, how they checked their phones nervously when he wasn't looking, how they forced themselves to laugh at comments that weren't funny. She had served men like Marcus before, men who believed the world existed solely for their benefit, and she had learned to navigate their egos like a ship captain navigating dangerous waters. Marcus raised his hand without looking up from his phone, snapping his fingers in the air like he was calling a dog. The sound cut through the restaurant's gentle ambiance, causing several nearby diners to glance over with disapproval. Amara took a deep breath, reminding herself that tuition was due next week and her brother needed new textbooks, then approached the table with her notepad ready. Marcus didn't acknowledge her presence for a full 30 seconds, continuing to scroll through his phone while she stood there, waiting. Finally, he looked up, his cold blue eyes scanning her from head to toe with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for things deemed unimportant. Without any greeting or basic courtesy, he began speaking in rapid German, his voice carrying a sharp edge of arrogance. Ich möchte das Ribeye-Steak, blutig, mit Trüffelbutter. Die Kartoffeln sollten 3-mal frittiert werden, nicht 2-mal, und ich will den Spargel nur leicht gedämpft. Der Wein sollte ein Chateau Margaux 2010 sein, und wenn Sie keinen haben, dann will ich mit dem Sommelier sprechen, weil das inakzeptabel wäre. His German was flawless, crisp and precise, each word chosen deliberately. He wanted the ribeye steak, bloody rare, with truffle butter, the potatoes triple fried, the asparagus barely steamed, and a specific vintage of wine that he knew would challenge the restaurant's inventory. The 3 executives at the table shifted uncomfortably, not understanding a word but recognizing the tone. Marcus had done this before in their presence, speaking in different languages to waitstaff in restaurants around the world, always with the same smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was a power play, a way to demonstrate his superiority, to make others feel small and inadequate. He leaned back in his chair, that familiar smirk spreading across his face as he watched Amara, clearly expecting her to fumble, to apologize, to call for someone else who might understand. In his mind, he had already won this little game. After all, what were the chances that a young black waitress in a Chicago steakhouse would understand his perfect German? He had specifically chosen German because it was less common than French or Spanish, and he had added technical culinary terms to make it even more challenging. The executives watched nervously, one of them clearing his throat as if to intervene. But Marcus silenced him with a raised hand, his eyes never leaving Amara's face, waiting for the confusion he was certain would appear. But Amara didn't flinch. Her expression remained perfectly pleasant, professionally neutral, as she wrote on her notepad without missing a beat. She had understood every word, every nuance, every deliberately complicated instruction. Her grandmother had been a military translator who had raised her on 3 languages before she could properly walk. German had been Amara's first love, the language she dreamed in sometimes, the language of the poetry she read late at night when she couldn't sleep. She had spent a semester in Berlin during her junior year, living with a host family who owned a restaurant, learning not just the language but the culture, the subtle ways that words could carry meaning beyond their literal translation. She recognized immediately what Marcus was doing, the game he was playing, and she made a decision in that moment that would change everything. Instead of responding verbally, instead of giving him the satisfaction of hearing her accent or watching her struggle with pronunciation, she simply nodded, finished writing, and said in perfect English, "I'll have that right out for you, sir. Gentlemen, have you decided on your orders?" Her voice was calm, professional, giving nothing away. The next 20 minutes passed in what seemed like slow motion for everyone at the table. Marcus continued to hold court, telling a story about a recent acquisition his company had made, how he had crushed the competition and sent several smaller companies into bankruptcy. He spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had never experienced real hardship, describing the layoffs that followed as necessary trimming of fat, and the families affected as collateral damage in the war of business. The executives nodded along, their smiles not reaching their eyes, trapped between their need for their jobs and their disgust at their boss's callousness. One of them, a younger man named David who had only been with the company for 6 months, looked particularly uncomfortable. His jaw clenched as Marcus described firing a 60-year-old manager 2 weeks before his retirement would have vested. Amara heard it all as she served other tables, her movements fluid and professional, but her mind was working, processing, deciding. She had seen the wedding ring on David's finger, noticed the photo of children that had flashed on his phone screen, recognized the exhaustion in his eyes that spoke of late nights and early mornings trying to please an impossible boss. When Amara returned to the table, she carried the perfectly prepared steak, the triple fried potatoes golden and crispy, the asparagus still bright green with the faintest touch of steam rising from it. She placed the plate in front of Marcus with practiced precision, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of cream-colored paper. Without a word, she placed it beside his plate, gave a small professional nod, and turned to serve the other executives their meals. Marcus barely glanced at the note at first, too busy examining his steak to ensure it met his exacting standards. He cut into the meat, watching the blood pool on the plate exactly as he had demanded, and nodded with satisfaction. It was only after he had taken his first bite, after he had made a show of savoring it while his executives watched, that he noticed the note still sitting beside his plate. With the casual arrogance of someone who expected it to be the check or perhaps a phone number from an ambitious waitress, he picked it up and unfolded it with one hand while reaching for his wine glass with the other. The words on the paper were written in immaculate German script, the kind taught in the finest European schools, each letter formed with elegant precision. Sehr geehrter Herr Steinberg, Ihr Steak wurde genau nach Ihren Spezifikationen zubereitet. Ich hoffe, es schmeckt Ihnen so gut, wie es Ihnen gefallen hat, Ihre Überlegenheit zur Schau zu stellen. Übrigens, ich spreche 5 Sprachen fließend, habe einen Abschluss in internationaler Wirtschaft und kenne die Geschichte Ihres Unternehmens sehr gut. Ich weiß von den Arbeitern in Ihrer Fabrik in Dresden, die Sie letzte Woche entlassen haben, kurz vor Weihnachten. Ich weiß von dem Umweltskandal in München, den Sie vertuscht haben. Und ich weiß, dass der Mann zu Ihrer Rechten, David Morrison, der Whistleblower ist, der mit der SEC gesprochen hat. Guten Appetit. The message was devastating in its precision. She knew about his company's layoffs in Dresden, about the environmental scandal in Munich that he thought he had buried, and most shocking of all, she had identified David as the whistleblower who had been secretly talking to the Securities and Exchange Commission about financial irregularities in the company. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, a piece of perfectly cooked steak dangling from it as his face went through a series of transformations. First confusion, then recognition, then a draining of all color as the implications hit him. His hand began to tremble slightly, causing the meat to fall from his fork back onto the plate with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over their table. The executives noticed the change immediately, David going particularly rigid as Marcus's eyes snapped toward him with a look that could have melted steel. The entire restaurant seemed to pause, as if everyone had unconsciously sensed the dramatic shift in energy at the center table. Marcus's eyes darted around the room, searching for Amara, but she had disappeared into the kitchen. His breathing became shallow, rapid, his mind racing through the implications. How could she know? Who was she? Was she a federal agent? A journalist? Had he just been caught in some kind of sting operation? The wine glass in his other hand began to shake, the expensive vintage sloshing dangerously close to the rim. David, sensing the danger, began to stand. But Marcus's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising force. "Sit," he hissed in English, his German accent suddenly thick with stress. The mask of control he always wore had cracked, revealing something desperate and frightened underneath. The other two executives looked between their boss and their colleague, understanding that something momentous was happening but not knowing what. Marcus read the note again, his lips moving silently as he processed the German words, hoping he had misunderstood. But the meaning remained crystal clear. This waitress, this young woman he had dismissed as beneath notice, knew secrets that could destroy him. She knew about David, which meant David's position was compromised. But more importantly, it meant that Marcus's own crimes were known. The Munich scandal alone could result in criminal charges, and the Dresden layoffs had violated numerous European Union labor laws. His empire, built on intimidation and carefully hidden deceits, was suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Amara emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of desserts for another table, moving with the same calm professionalism she had displayed all evening. She passed by Marcus's table without a glance, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of his carefully constructed world. Marcus watched her serve an elderly couple at a corner table, laughing gently at something the old man said, helping the woman adjust her shawl with genuine kindness. The contrast between her warmth with those customers and the surgical precision with which she had dissected him was jarring. He realized with growing horror that he had no idea who she really was. The assumptions he had made based on her appearance, her job, her age, her race, all of it had been weapons she had turned against him. She had allowed him to underestimate her, had played the role he expected, all while gathering intelligence and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Mr. Steinberg," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Perhaps we should go." But Marcus couldn't move. He was frozen in place, his mind struggling to process how completely the tables had been turned. He had walked into this restaurant feeling invincible, surrounded by people who feared him, wielding his power like a club. Now, he sat exposed and vulnerable, brought low by someone he had dismissed without a second thought. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he was too panicked to appreciate it. All those times he had played language games with service workers, all those moments of manufactured superiority, had led to this. He had finally encountered someone who could play the game better than he could, someone who had turned his own arrogance into a weapon against him. The note still rested in his trembling hand, the elegant German script seeming to mock him with its perfection. The other executives began to murmur among themselves, sensing their boss's distress but not understanding its cause. Marcus couldn't explain without revealing the contents of the note, which would mean admitting to the crimes Amara had listed. He was trapped, caught between his need to maintain his image and his desperate desire to know more about this waitress who had somehow gained access to his darkest secrets. His phone buzzed on the table, and he saw with growing dread that it was his lawyer calling. Then it buzzed again, this time his head of security. Then again, a number he didn't recognize but suspected might be a federal investigator. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Whatever Amara had set in motion, it was already spreading beyond this restaurant, beyond this moment. His empire was beginning to crumble, and he could feel it happening in real time, like watching a building collapse in slow motion. Amara appeared at the table once more, this time carrying the leather folder with their check. She placed it gently beside Marcus, her expression still professionally pleasant, giving nothing away. But as she set it down, she spoke quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, and this time it was in perfect English with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. Your assumptions about people will be your downfall, Mr. Steinberg. The world is full of people you've dismissed and underestimated, people you've stepped on while climbing your ladder. We remember, we talk to each other, and sometimes we fight back. She straightened up, her voice returning to its normal volume and professional tone. Whenever you're ready, sir. No rush. Then she was gone again, leaving Marcus to stare at the check with unseeing eyes, his world reshaping itself around him in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The restaurant continued around them, other diners enjoying their meals, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. But at the center table, everything had changed. David slowly pulled his wrist free from Marcus's now slack grip, standing carefully as if any sudden movement might cause an explosion. The other two executives followed suit, mumbling excuses about early meetings and family obligations. Marcus didn't try to stop them. He knew they would distance themselves from him now, rats fleeing a sinking ship. By morning, the news would be everywhere. The SEC investigation would be public, the Munich scandal would be in the newspapers, and the Dresden layoffs would trigger a European Union inquiry. His board of directors would call an emergency meeting, his lawyers would demand astronomical fees to manage the crisis, and his carefully maintained image would shatter like glass. All because he had chosen to play a cruel game with the wrong person, because he had assumed that his position and privilege made him untouchable. As the executives filed out, leaving Marcus alone at the table, Amara stood near the kitchen door, watching. She felt no joy in what she had done, only a grim satisfaction that justice would finally be served. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her contact at the SEC confirming that they had received the package of evidence she had compiled over the past 6 months. It hadn't been about the language game at all. That had simply been the final test, the moment when Marcus had shown his true colors so clearly that any doubt about what needed to be done had evaporated. Amara had been investigating him for months, using her position at the restaurant where he regularly entertained clients to gather information, to listen to his boastful confessions, to document his crimes. She was not just a waitress, though that job had been real enough, needed enough to pay her bills. She was also a forensic accounting student, specializing in corporate crime, and Marcus Steinberg had become her thesis project without knowing it. The rain outside had intensified, lightning flashing across the Chicago skyline, illuminating the city in stark, brief moments of clarity. Marcus finally stood, his movements mechanical, his face still pale and drawn. He pulled out his wallet, threw several $100 bills on the table without counting them, and walked toward the door with the unsteady gait of someone who had just received a terminal diagnosis. As he passed the host station, he heard one of the servers say to another, "Did you see that?" That CEO ordered his steak in German, and Amara replied with a note that made him freeze completely. "I've never seen anything like it." The words followed him out into the storm, where his driver waited with an umbrella that couldn't protect him from what was coming. The rain soaked through his expensive suit within seconds, but he barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead to damage control, to lawyers and crisis management, to a future that looked nothing like the one he had imagined when he walked into the restaurant that evening. Inside Marcello's, Amara finished her shift with the same professionalism she had shown all night. She served her remaining tables, helped close down her section, and split her tips with the busboys and kitchen staff as she always did. Her manager, Mr. Rodriguez, who had always treated her with respect and fairness, pulled her aside as she was preparing to leave. "Amara," he said quietly, "I don't know what happened with Mr. Steinberg tonight, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost when he left. You okay?" She smiled at him, genuine warmth in her expression. "I'm fine, Mr. Rodriguez. Better than fine, actually. I think tonight might have been my last shift, though. I've got some new opportunities opening up." He nodded, understanding without needing details that something significant had occurred. "Well, you'll always have a place here if you—" Need it. You're one of the best we've ever had." The compliment meant more to her than he could know, coming as it did after a night when she had proven that being the best meant so much more than simply serving food with a smile. As Amara walked to her car, she thought about the path that had led her to this moment. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, she had watched her mother work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat after her father's death. She had seen how people like Marcus Steinberg made decisions in boardrooms that destroyed families like hers, how they viewed workers as numbers on spreadsheets rather than human beings with dreams and struggles. Her grandmother, the one who had taught her languages, had always said, "Knowledge is power, baby girl, but only if you know when and how to use it." Tonight, she had used it all, every language skill, every piece of financial knowledge, every observation from months of careful watching and listening. The investigation she had helped build would take down not just Marcus but several other executives who had been complicit in his crimes. The workers in Dresden would receive compensation. The environmental damage in Munich would be addressed. And David Morrison would be protected as a whistleblower who had risked everything to do the right thing. Her phone rang as she reached her car, and she smiled when she saw the caller ID. It was Professor Williams, her mentor at the university, the one who had suggested she take the job at Marcello's when she learned that several corporate executives under investigation were regular customers there. "Amara," his warm voice filled her ear. "I heard from my contact at the SEC. They're moving forward with everything. Your work was impeccable. Have you given any thought to their offer?" She had, of course. The SEC wanted to hire her as soon as she graduated, to work in their financial crimes division. After tonight, after seeing the look on Marcus Steinberg's face when he realized that his assumptions had been his downfall, she knew what her answer would be. "Yes, Professor. Tell them yes. But I want to finish my degree first. And I want to write my thesis on corporate linguistic discrimination and how it masks financial crimes." He laughed, the sound rich with pride. "That's my girl. Change the world, but get your education first. Your grandmother would be proud." As she drove home through the rain-washed streets of Chicago, Amara thought about all the other Marcus Steinbergs out there, men and women who used their power and privilege to crush those they deemed beneath them. They existed in every industry, in every city, hiding behind their expensive suits and exclusive restaurants, speaking in codes they believed others couldn't understand. But there would always be people like her, people who had been underestimated and dismissed, who had learned to turn invisibility into a superpower. The note she had written in German had been just one small victory in a much larger war, but it had been a satisfying one. She had shown Marcus that the people he ignored and belittled were not just props in his story but protagonists in their own right, capable of changing the narrative when given the chance. The CEO who had ordered his steak in German, so certain of his superiority, had learned that the black waitress who replied fluently with a note had more power than he had ever imagined. The next morning, the story broke across financial news networks with the force of a hurricane. Steinberg Industries CEO under federal investigation for financial fraud and environmental crimes, the headline screamed. The coverage included leaked documents, whistleblower testimony, and a trail of evidence that led directly back to Marcus Steinberg himself. But buried in the third paragraph of the New York Times article was a curious detail that would become legend in certain circles. The investigation had been aided by an unnamed source who had spent months gathering evidence while working in plain sight at a Chicago restaurant frequented by the executives. The story of the CEO who ordered his steak in German and the waitress who responded with a note that made him freeze would be told and retold in business schools and ethics classes. A cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and the power of those who society overlooks. But for those who knew the full story, it was something more. A reminder that revolution sometimes comes not with violence or protests, but with a perfectly written note, delivered at exactly the right moment, in a language the oppressor never expected the oppressed to understand. Marcus Steinberg would spend the next several years fighting legal battles that would drain his fortune and destroy his reputation. His company would be restructured under new leadership, with David Morrison eventually becoming CEO and implementing the kind of ethical practices Marcus had always mocked as weakness. The workers in Dresden would return to their jobs with better contracts and protection, while the environmental damage in Munich would be cleaned up at the company's expense. But perhaps the most lasting change would be in how the company treated its service workers, from janitors to food service staff, with a new corporate culture that recognized that brilliance and capability existed at every level of society. Marcus himself would end up working as a consultant for a small firm in Delaware, his influence reduced to giving advice that was rarely heeded, his languages skills useless in a world where he no longer had power over others. Sometimes, late at night, he would think about that note written in perfect German, and wonder what might have been different if he had simply ordered his steak in English. With courtesy and respect, Amara graduated summa cum laude 6 months later, her thesis on corporate crime and linguistic discrimination winning the university's highest honors. She joined the SEC as their youngest investigator, specializing in cases where corporate executives used cultural and linguistic barriers to hide their crimes. Her office wall featured a single framed item, not her degrees or commendations, but a photocopy of a note written in German, a reminder of the night when she had proven that those who are underestimated often hold the most power. She would go on to take down 17 more corporate criminals in her first 5 years, each one making the same mistake Marcus had made, assuming that their position made them untouchable, that the people serving them were beneath notice or consideration. But Amara knew better. She knew that every waitress, every janitor, every overlooked service worker was a potential revolutionary, armed with intelligence and capability that the powerful never bothered to see. The world was full of people like her, waiting for their moment, ready to flip the script on those who thought themselves invincible. Years later, when Amara had become a legend in financial crimes investigation, a young journalist would track down the story of that night at Marcello's, interviewing everyone from the other executives who had been at the table to Mr. Rodriguez, who still managed the restaurant. They all remembered it differently, but they all agreed on one thing. The moment when Marcus Steinberg read that note and froze was the moment when the entire power structure in that room shifted, when the invisible became visible, when the dismissed became dangerous. The journalist would title their article, "The Night the CEO Ordered His Steak in German," and the black waitress replied fluently with a note that made him freeze. And it would go viral, inspiring countless others who had been underestimated to stand up and fight back in their own ways. But for Amara, it would always be simpler than that. It was the night she had proven her grandmother right. Knowledge was indeed power, but only when you knew exactly when and how to use it. The story became a modern parable, told in business schools and civil rights seminars, adapted into documentaries and podcast series, each telling adding new layers of meaning. Some saw it as a story about corporate crime and justice, others as a tale of racial and class dynamics in America, still others as a testament to the power of education and languages. But at its heart, it remained the story of a single moment in a Chicago steakhouse, when assumptions were shattered and power was transferred through nothing more than a piece of paper with words written in German. It was proof that revolutions didn't always require armies or protests, that sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply refusing to be what others expected you to be. Marcus Steinberg had ordered his steak in German, expecting submission and confusion. Instead, he had received a response that changed his life forever, delivered by a young black woman who had been invisible to him until the moment she chose to be seen. The waitress who replied fluently with a note had done more than serve a meal. She had served justice, cold and precisely prepared, exactly as ordered. In the end, the story of the CEO who ordered his steak in German and the black waitress who replied fluently with a note that made him freeze became more than just an account of one night in a restaurant. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that those who hold power should never assume they are the only ones who understand the game being played. Amara Johnson went on to have a distinguished career, eventually becoming the head of the SEC's Financial Crimes Division, where she implemented new policies requiring corporations to maintain ethical standards that protected workers at every level. She never forgot that night at Marcello's, the weight of the plate in her hand as she served Marcus his perfectly prepared steak, the feel of the paper as she placed the note beside his plate. the look in his eyes when he realized that his assumptions had been his downfall. It had been a small moment in the grand scheme of things, but it had changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with violence, but with words written in perfect German, delivered by someone the world had taught him not to see.